Order. Sir John Hayes to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a delight to be here and a delight to speak on this important subject, which is of great importance to my constituents, both consumers and producers. A free economy works best when those who can buy and those who can sell can do so in a multiplicity of places. Nowhere is that more important than in the field of food, for food is the most basic of all commodities. We all, after all, need to eat. And that variety prevailed for most of time. Indeed, if one thinks of the earliest civilizations, the way we mark them is their trading capacity. Those in the Levant who traded food produced there in markets between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. And yet, in my lifetime, in all our lifetimes in this country, that has changed in respect of the provision of food. And it was Napoleon who described the British as the nation of shopkeepers, if only that was still true. Because in my boyhood, my mother could shop at a variety of places to obtain the food products and other household items that she needed. What has happened during my lifetime is that a monopoly supply, or near monopoly supply, of the provision of food has emerged. And it's emerged, of course, in the form of the great behemoths, the huge supermarkets, the corporate interests that now dominate the provision of food. That has broken the food chain. Let's have no doubt about where we are as a nation in respect to the provision and consumption of foodstuffs. The food chain is broken, and governments of all colours have been reluctant to face that reality, because the defence of the fact that most people now are obliged, I emphasise that, obliged to buy their food from a handful of places, with little or no choice as to whether they do so or not, because, as I said, everyone has to buy and consume food. The fact that that has occurred, the defence of it has been that it's driven prices down. But I contest, in this short debate, that that is not really so. Bulk buying of food, which is now the norm, most people buy their food on a weekly basis, they fill their trolley with any number of goods, does three things. It firstly disguises the relationship between cost and value. In the days when people bought as they needed, they had a pretty good idea of what things cost and whether they were providing value for money. When you fill this basket, of course, those details are lost in bulk purchase, and it allows supermarkets to produce what they call, I think, loss leaders, cheaper products which draw people in, only to... I happily give way.
Thank you very much. I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. The Groceries Code Adjudicator is, of course, vitally important, but my party and I believe that its remit is too narrow. Would the right honourable member agree with me that it's time for a new Groceries Code Regulatory Authority with powers to introduce price floors and ceilings, ensuring fair prices for suppliers and consumers?
I'm delighted to accept her advice on that. She's not, in parliamentary technical terms, my honourable friend, but she's a friend nonetheless. And of course, she's right in her assertion, which I shall move to after I've entertained the House a little further with my preparation, as it were, for making exactly that argument. Because the essence of my call today is that this government needs to take action to deal with the near-monopolistic supply of foodstuffs, which our constituents are obliged, I use the word again, obliged to endure. The best way of doing that is through a more regulated market, and she's right to say so. But let me set the scene a little more before I come to the point at which I call for exactly what she's suggested. You see, as well as these loss leaders that I mentioned, which have the seductive effect on consumers of encouraging them to buy many other things, that kind of provision of food has led to a great deal of food waste. We know that in all of the studies that have been done, these days, much of what people buy, perhaps 20%, perhaps a little more, actually is never consumed. That would have been unthinkable a couple of generations ago. Absolutely. People wouldn't have believed that it was possible, actually, that you could stock your pantry or fridge with all kinds of things that you ended up dispensing, that ended up on the scrap heap. I give way to the Select Committee Chairman, to whom I pay tribute, actually, for, on this subject, for bravely making the case that I will make with less expertise than him today.
Gentleman flatters to deceive, I fear. You know, he's absolutely right about the way in which grocery supermarkets go about their business. But a lot of this is the way in which they choose to go about their business. I heard recently from a livestock farmer who bought in potatoes to feed their stock. He's expected to find that they would be green, that they would be bruised, that they would be damaged in some way. When they arrived, they were absolutely perfect. They just weren't conform to the particular specification that the supermarket demanded. That's not a demand that's coming from consumers. That's a demand that is coming directly from the supermarkets. And if you look around Europe elsewhere, the right honourable gentleman will find that actually supermarkets there behave in a very different way.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right, and of course it's why when he and I were in government together, we introduced the Groceries Code Adjudicator. You will remember that I worked with his colleague Vince Cable, then a Secretary of State, very closely, and was involved in that decision. He's also right to focus on the producers. I've spoken so far about consumers. I want to go on to talk about the distortion in respect to producers. So I began my speech by speaking about both producers and consumers needing the multiplicity of places to buy and sell. Because, of course, in the model that I set out, the model that prevailed for eons, really, people who made food, who grew food, primary and secondary producers, were able to sell to a variety of places. I mean, all of our lifetimes, I suspect, now I'm probably underestimating, or perhaps overestimating the age of some of the people here, but certainly in many of our lifetimes, let's put it that way, markets existed in where farmers would take their produce and trade them, auction them. There was a livestock market in Spalding in the streets until the 1930s, and a covered market until the 1990s, which livestock was brought and bought and traded very openly, auctioned indeed. And so producers too have been affected by this distortion. And as the food chain breaks, it's not just consumers that struggle, as they can only go to one or two places to get what they want. But it's not just what they want, it's what they need. Because foodstuffs, as I say, are fundamental. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The right honourable gentleman in bringing this forward. It's an incredibly important topic, and those of us who are here will express that very shortly. But does he welcome, I think we should all welcome, the commitment from, and I give three examples, Tesco's, Asda's and Lidl's. And my constituent of Strangford, they have an arrangement with the local community groups on a Friday night or Saturday where the goods that are perhaps coming near their life but are still consumable, that they give them to community groups, and the community groups in turn give them out, filter them out to the people in the community who need help, the families who are on the poverty levels. And sometimes, while we are hard on the stores, the superstores for what they do, we also have to recognise there are occasions whenever they play their bit as well.
The honourable gentleman is right, and of course his endless goodwill, known in this House for a considerable time, encourages him to emphasise the fact that supermarkets do deal with the waste products they produce, because inevitably, as well as the waste products that overconsumption produces, so supermarkets throw away a lot of the things on their shelves because of sell-by dates. So it's hard to get a real handle on that because quite a lot of it is disguised, but supermarkets themselves are actually contributing to immense amounts of food waste. And it's true that some communities have found settlements for all of this in the way he described. And some supermarkets have paid lip service at least, and I say at least because it's occasionally more than that, to redistributing some of that waste food from their shelves into communities. But we shouldn't be gulled by that. You know, Burke said, didn't he, that tyrants seldom need a pretext. And this is a kind of economic tyranny, really. I mean, to have a circumstance where a near cartel of supermarkets can determine the price of products and then foist them on to a consumer base that has little option is about as tyrannical as you can imagine in commercial terms. And so you can tell from all of that, Madam Chairman, that I'm not a great admirer of the large retailers, and it's not just for the reasons I've given. I doubt whether, for example, they are particularly careful, and by that I mean they're careless, about the circumstances of both their customers and their employees. I am not confident that a supermarket chain will have quite the sensitivity to a locality, to a community, to a group of people that become their customers and become their employees that a small family business would. And I've still got, happily, some of those small family businesses selling food in my constituency, and thank goodness I have. But their number has shrunk. The nation of shopkeepers is now a nation of very large shops, and they are corporate entities rather than what the kind of shops that Napoleon, I imagine, had in mind. So there is a huge problem. It's affected our high streets, of course, which have become more ubiquitous, as the only thing that you can spot is a Tesco or a Sainsbury's, or perhaps an Aldi or a Lidl, rather than the variety that you would have once seen up and down our constituencies. And it's affected producers. And I want to come to that in the second part of what I have to say, Madam Chairman, because my constituency is disproportionately responsible for the production of UK food. Lincolnshire grows 30% of the UK's vegetables, 20% of the sugar beet, 18% of the poultry, 20% of potatoes, and processes 70% of the kingdom's fish. In total, my county produces 12% of all the food that fills the shops and shelves, the pantries and fridges of our country. And so you will understand from that the particular concerns of farmers and growers in my constituency about the way in which those big retailers treat them. Because back to the picture I painted of an open economy where people can sell to in a variety of places, that has long gone. Most of my primary producers have very few options and therefore have a gun put to their head very often by their customers, the supermarkets. That might affect their terms of trade. It may affect the prices they're offered, which is why the relationship between farm gate prices and retail prices is again distorted in this broken food chain. It very often involves sharper practice still, where supermarkets will cancel orders very quickly, even when a farmer has worked up, tooled up, if I can put it in those terms, ready to provide goods. They will find in the next season they no longer have a contract to do so. It has included in the past supermarkets lumping all kinds of other costs onto the supplier, marketing costs, transport costs, and so on. This is unacceptable, and it's ultimately unsustainable as those businesses make too little profit to reinvest and therefore become less competitive. You might say, well, surely the supermarkets need to obtain their goods to sell them. But of course, we know where they then go. They import goods from countries who produce them at standards that we can't imagine in this country, thereby putting even more pressure on domestic producers. And do we really want that? Or do we want a country that cares about food security, becomes more economically resilient because more of what we consume is made here. A former Labour Prime Minister once spoke of British jobs for British workers. He was right. We do want British jobs for British workers, and we want British goods for British consumers too. We need to recognise that the provision of food as locally as possible both provides that economic security, cements and secures communities, shortens supply lines, therefore having immense environmental benefits apart from anything else by cutting food miles. And it's the kind of economy that we can have, for there is nothing inevitable, nothing preordained about fewer and fewer food suppliers dominating the food chain. Now, I want to move now specifically to the changes we can make, because I've spoken about the impact on consumers of reduced choice. I've spoken about the impact on producers of not being able to trade their goods fairly and freely. But as well as the decline in income for all types of farm between in the last several years, and the DEFRA figures I think suggest the sharp decline between 2023 and 2024. There is a huge issue with the GCA that I was proud to be part of setting up in 2013. There have only been two major investigations by the Groceries Code Adjudicator since then, Tesco's in 2015 and the Co-op in 2018. The GCA's power to fine retailers came into force in 2015 and applies only to breaches that occurred after that date, so it did not apply to the first of those investigations. And in 2018, the adjudicator said that it did not consider, quote, the nature and seriousness of the breaches by the Co-op meriting a financial penalty. So although the Groceries Code Adjudicator has had the power to both investigate and punish those retailers that were breaching the Groceries Code, for that is what the adjudicator oversees, they haven't done so. Why is that, you might say, Madam Chairman? Where is this reluctance rooted? What has been the reason for that? Well, partly that those detrimentally affected by the broken food chain are reluctant to report their problems, their issues to the adjudicator, because they fear they'll be identified and later punished. These economic tyrants have little mercy after all. And because they can go nowhere else to sell their produce, what would they then do? They literally would have nowhere to go. Partly, I think, because of the powers of the adjudicator being insufficient. And that's really the reason and purpose of this debate, reason for and purpose of this debate today. So it's, although I'm pleased that it's now reported that the adjudicator is taking a look at Amazon, I just, as a matter of record, want to say I've never bought anything on Amazon and never will. Let's just establish that before we go any further. I like to buy my goods in small shops, face-to-face, meet real people. I don't want to live in the virtual world, I want to live in the real world. Why wouldn't we? So that is good news, but I fear, rather like the two previous investigations, it may lead to nothing. It may raise false hopes of action that won't in the end be taken. I do hope the Minister, who I know is, by the way, and I say this not because I want to flatter him, because I have a high regard for the Chairman of the Select Committee, by the way, who, as I said, I work within government. Not all Liberals are as bad as they're painted, at least not as bad as they're painted by me, that's for sure. And I know too that the Minister is a good and responsible Minister who will be listening to this debate with care. And I just implore him, and the Shadow Minister, by the way, because the previous government's record is not great on this either, to step up to the mark, because this is unsustainable. It can't continue. We can't perpetuate a situation where a handful of corporate giants wield disproportionate power over the provision of food and by so doing, dictate the food security of this country. Because if they continue to import food at the rate they are, without care, how can we be food secure? Let me deal with the particular measures we'd like to see in respect of the adjudicator. We need to extend the role of the adjudicator to include more retailers and food service providers, including food manufacturing businesses. Because at the moment the scope is narrow. We need to find a better way of guaranteeing the anonymity of those who bring their complaints to the adjudicator. I know that efforts have been made in that respect, and even at the time we set up the system, we were mindful of that and tried to create some degree of protection for people going to the adjudicator with complaints. But I'm not sure that's bedded in as well as it might have done. And I know from speaking to farmers and growers in my constituency, who I meet, by the way, weekly, that they still fear that that is a barrier to the effective application of the adjudicator's powers. We need to expand the remit to include the ornamental sector. Important in my constituency, by the way, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Lincolnshire, and particularly South Holland and the Deepings, has a thriving ornamental sector, employing a large number of people in many smaller businesses, often family-run businesses, but of course they're outside the scope of the adjudicator currently and should be included. And I think we need also for the adjudicator to have a role in initiating inquiries and studies rather than simply waiting for complaints. It would be perfectly reasonable for the adjudicator to, on the basis of his or her expertise, it's a him at the moment, but it has been a her, to initiate inquiries in particular aspects of food provision and retailer behaviour. So we want a more proactive role. I mean, when the role was established, it was dubbed the Food Ombudsman. Now, that was never the official title, but perhaps it ought to be, really. Rather than simply having a narrow remit to enforce the Groceries Code, perhaps the adjudicator could have a slightly broader remit to look at the whole issue of the provision of food and its relationship with food security. When people like the Right Honourable Gentleman and I began speaking about food security donkeys years ago, it was regarded as a rather arcane subject. We were seen as mildly eccentric for worrying about such things. Now food security is a salient. It's at the top of many nations' political agendas, but more than that, it's become critically important to national well-being. And so what a good time it would be to think more laterally about the role of this food ombudsman and how they might reinforce the government's commitment to food security. It would be a way of delivering the objectives which the government have set out. They've said that they are keen to reinforce food security, so why not use this as the means of doing so? It would allow the adjudicator to develop a strategy to roll out a set of coordinated actions against unfair practices. And I would include I would include in that prices, because whilst it's true, all of the techniques I've briefly outlined are used to distort the relationship between buyers and sellers. There's also the issue of prices. How can we ensure that the farm gate price and the retail price are brought into closer union? Because we had I regard it as obscene, actually, the obscene spectacle just before last Christmas of one or two of the retailers bagging a whole series of vegetables in a plastic bag and saying, you buy these for 12p. And I had farmers and growers in my constituency saying, we have toiled hard to produce high-quality produce, okay, only to see that produce being sold at a price far below the cost of production. And is it any wonder then that the consumer doesn't appreciate the hard work that goes into making food and the quality of that food grown in this country? And I do think there's got to be some sense in which we reunite value and cost by looking closely at the price farmers are paid and the price consumers subsequently pay. That's not to encourage food inflation. It's simply to ensure that everyone gets a fair share of that bigger cake rather than be eaten up in the profits of these corporate behemoths. Finally, let me say this. I, by and large, favour a capitalist economy. I'm not an unbridled admirer of capitalism. I'm a conservative, after all. How could I be? But I think it's on balance perhaps the best of a series of faulted options. But capitalism, as I said at the outset, works when people can buy and sell in a multiplicity of places. That does not prevail at the moment in respect of food in the United Kingdom. And empowering the Groceries Code Adjudicator, which henceforth shall always be known, I think, as the Food Ombudsman, we may be able to rebalance the provision of food and join again the food chain so badly broken. Thank you.
I remind members that they should